Okay, we're going to get started here, and I know this is the moment you've all been waiting for. That's right. So this is philosophy in prison, and as we heard some people earlier say, what? Philosophy in prison? How can that be? And we're going to find out tonight from three people who have taught philosophy in prison why it might be valuable and how we could go about maybe doing more of that. So I'm Alec Muthig, and I've introduced myself earlier. I'm co-coordinator of Wyoming Pathways from Prison, and I actually have a master's degree in philosophy that I received here at the University of Wyoming a few years ago. And yeah, through years of teaching, I found that philosophy, more than a lot of other topics, was very, very transformative in those who took my classes at various community colleges, etc. And so when we started Wyoming Pathways from Prison, one of the things I really wanted to do was I wanted to somehow bring philosophy education into correctional facilities because of those experiences I had had before. I knew that Dr. Colter had a wonderful Stoic camp, and I thought, what a fantastic topic to possibly start off philosophy in prison in Wyoming. And so I approached him thinking maybe he would do it, and he was very excited about it. And it has turned out wonderfully, and looks like that's what we'll be talking about first. So I'd like to introduce the three panelists because I can go on talking for far too long. So we've got Dr. Robert Colter. And Dr. Colter is a professional academic lecturer here at the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at the University of Wyoming. And he's also the founder of UW's Stoic Camp. And I know a few of you here have done the Stoic Camp before. And our first philosophy program in prison was based on that Stoic Camp. We actually called it Stoic Camp. And we've co-taught in prison together multiple times. We also have Ben Walker joining us from the United Kingdom. He's the founder of the Crito project, and he'll be talking about his project. And we have Damon Horowitz, who's a professor of philosophy at Columbia University. He's also taught courses in artificial intelligence, cognitive science at NYU, Stanford, UPenn, San Quentin State Prison. And so I'm going to hand it off to Dr. Colter to start.
Thanks everybody for being here. I'm going to try to not talk too long, but it can be a risk. I've allowed myself 5 slides. We've been kind of talking today a little bit, sort of, it seems like kind of from a bird's eye view, policy level sort of stuff. What I want to share is a little bit sort of on the ground, what goes on when I teach in Wyoming prisons. And when I teach Stoicism in particular, which several people have mentioned. Maybe a lot of you don't know what that's about, so I want to talk about some of the practicalities of teaching philosophy in prison here in Wyoming. But then I also want to say a little bit about what Stoicism is, hopefully give you guys some ideas about those of you who don't know already. And then I want to talk about how it's affected some of my students. First, just some practical stuff, right? Wyoming is, I think Dr. Dewey mentioned earlier, is kind of a small town with really long roads. And by really long, I mean it takes like 5 hours to get to the next place. And that's true of our prison facilities here in the state. They're kind of a long way away. It's pretty tough to commute. So what we've done is 1 week intensive courses where we meet with usually a couple groups of students, small groups, maybe averaging about 15 per group. And we'll meet for 2.5 to 3 hours every day for 5 days straight. And we do some intensive close reading of some of these texts from antiquity. We use modern translations and so on, but and then they have daily writing assignments, which I'll say something about. We're all done in 5 days, except then they'll have like a term paper kind of thing afterwards, a short reflection sort of paper. yeah, those are the practicalities I think I wanted to mention. Next thing, Stoicism. Stoicism is a school of philosophy. It's a way of life philosophy is what we think about it. The goal of Stoic philosophy, they said, was how do we live well, right? And the picture they take into that, I'll talk about a couple details here, but it's about orienting ourselves and an understanding of who we are as human beings, as rational agents, as decision makers, to the rest of the world, the universe around us, which includes other people and institutions and, you know, the planet we live on and so on. And one of the things that I think that makes Stoicism particularly apt for transformative experience is a lot of people that I've run into in the correction system are there because in one way or another, they have not figured out a way to think about how they relate to the rest of the world. In that way, they're not unlike a lot of undergraduate students, right? But they seem to have sort of bumped up against perhaps more significant consequences to that. There are three main ideas of Stoicism that I try to talk about in these courses in prison. The first one is what we call the dichotomy of control. Right, that's sort of a modern term for it, but it's derived from this passage that I'll just read from Epictetus. Some things are up to us and some are not up to us. Our opinions are up to us and our impulses, desires, aversions, in short, whatever is our own doing. Our bodies are not up to us, nor are our possessions, our reputations, or our public offices, or that is, whatever is not our own doing. Okay, so I want to say a little bit about that. What this passage is telling us is there's some things that are really under our control and some things are not. And it turns out the things that are really under our control are just those four things listed there, right? Our impulses, desires, aversions, and our opinions. And I think one way to think about this is the only thing we really have any control over is our own choices. It's our choices, in the case of our opinions, our choices about what to believe. In the cases of our impulses, our choices about what actions we're going to take. In the case of our desires and aversions, our choices about what things to want or want to avoid. So the Stoic picture is the only thing that's up to us. The only thing that's under our control is these choices. Everything else is not up to us, right? The choices of other people are not up to us. What happens in the world as far as like political change or environmental change or natural disasters or the past or the future are completely not up to us. And so the next step, the next idea is that virtue is the only true good. And that's related to this previous point. There can only be moral value with regard to things that we have control over. If someone were to kick me in the knee, I don't have any control over that. But what I do have control over is how I react to that, how I choose to react to that. And so the virtues are us choosing in those realms well, right? And they say the four big virtues are wisdom, courage, justice, and self-control. And these all have to do with those four main areas of control. We can talk more about that if you guys want later on, but the third idea, this is what I want to get to, is the idea of cosmopolitanism. Now, the basic idea of cosmopolitanism is that we are all citizens of the universe, and that's what cosmopolitan means. We're citizens of the universe in the sense that we're all part of the same world, right? We're all sort of, maybe a more hippie version of it is, we're all made of stars, man, right? We're all made of the same stuff. We all got parents, right? We all have to eat. We all have to breathe, right? We all have to interact with one another, right? And I want to share this passage with you because it kind of emphasizes the bit about cosmopolitanism, but the first part is one that the prisoners really latch onto pretty instantly, right? Say to yourself at the start of the day, I shall meet with meddling, ungrateful, violent, treacherous, envious, and unsociable people, right? We read that in class and the prisoners are like, yep, did that today, right? They're all subject to all these defects because they have no knowledge of good and bad. But I, who have observed the nature of the good and have seen that it is the right, and of the bad and seen that it is the wrong, and of the wrongdoer himself, and this is where the cosmopolitanism comes in, and seeing that his nature is akin to my own, not because he is of the same blood and seed, but because he shares as I do in mind, and thus in a portion of the divine. I then can neither be harmed by these people, nor become angry with one who is akin to me, nor can I hate him. For we have come into being to work together, like feet, hands, eyelids, or the two rows of teeth in our upper and lower jaws. To work against one another is therefore contrary to nature, and to be angry with another person and turn away from him is surely to work against him. And that's from Marcus Aurelius' meditation. One other point I wanted to make is, so here this is a passage from Marcus Aurelius, who you may know was emperor of Rome in the 2nd century CE. And at the time was literally the most powerful man in the world. And his meditations were a series of sort of stoic notes to himself, right? The title from antiquity of the meditations is literally to himself. And in fact, he probably never expected them to be published, right? I mean, maybe he would have known because they're going to gather all of his stuff after he dies, and a lot of it's going to see the light of day. But these were really sort of his own, what we call meditations on certain questions, right? And you can see here that even the most powerful man in the world is bothered by meeting meddling, ungrateful, violent, treacherous, envious, and unsociable people. He faces the same sort of struggle that these prisoners often do with their cellmate or the guy in the other pod or whatever it is. Given the sort of, especially with the men, the sort of fetishization of toughness that sometimes happens, not only in prison settings, but maybe especially, to see that there's this guy, right, who is emperor of Rome, who wrote these things we know mostly while he was on the battlefield. I mean, not actually on the battlefield, but in a tent near the battlefield and was overseeing war at the time. There's this sort of badassery about it that appeals to them. So those are some of the big ideas that we emphasize in looking at a lot of these passages. And I wanted to talk for a minute, too, about some of the assignments we give them to write and reflect upon. So the first assignment, really on the first day, we asked them to think about this idea of the dichotomy of control. And what's up to us, what's in our power, what's under our control, and what's not. And we asked them to apply that to a very specific situation in their lives. Now, some of them think about something that happened in their life prior to incarceration. Sometimes stuff, they really focus on stuff that's happened to them in the prison that week, right? Like this first example. These are some quotes from some student assignments. I can choose not to take things personally when an issue arises, like I did yesterday, when another individual accused me of stalking them at the very moment that I looked in their direction. And I thought, this is okay. I don't have to lose my cool over this trivial thing. He came up to me later and apologized for his outburst. This emotional distance allowed me to not take offense, to shrug this situation off as not mine to own, not mine to internalize. So this language of not mine is very straight out of the Stoic ideas. And I think this is a nice example of a description of what was talked about before, the Stoic step back idea, right? Let's step back and assess whether or not this, what in this situation is up to me and what's not. Another student reflected sort of in a more big picture way, right? He says, I've hurt people in the past. That's out of my control. What is in my control is that I don't keep hurting them. And I thought that was a really sort of poignant application of the dichotomy. So enough about that for now. We can talk more about it if you want later. Our final assignment, though, is a little bit difficult for some of them, right? What we asked them to do is to think about what might happen to them if they were to apply Stoic principles to their lives in the future, and to compare and contrast, right, their past or present selves with what that might look like, right? So here's the assignment, right? Using what you learned in class and through the readings, compare and contrast your past or present self with the person you might envision yourself becoming through the practice of Stoic principles and concepts. And we give them a number of things to think about in doing this. And we ask them to write about 1,000 to 1,500 word essay on this, right? Has it allowed you to see yourself differently just by learning these concepts and ideas? How do you envision them sort of playing out in practice in the future? Are there bits of the text that might be useful in clarifying some of these ideas, right? And when you're discussing this, we ask them to specifically identify these Stoic principles or virtues or ideals they have in mind. And I wanted to share a couple of excerpts of that, and then I'll be done. So one student wrote this in this final essay: the majority of my life I've lived on the opposite spectrum from the ideal Stoic way of life. I've actually spent more time fighting things that are out of my control just because others told me they were. I've also allowed the opinion of others to influence me much more than I should have. I've allowed others to guide me down a variety of paths that have ultimately led me here. And here I think he's reflecting specifically on the role that the dichotomy of control has played in his life, or his missing of the idea of the dichotomy of control. And the final one, this is from one of my favorite students, and I would have loved to share his whole essay with you, but for the sake of time and not making you read a whole bunch of stuff, this was his concluding paragraph. He said, my examination of self has yielded a tremendous amount of insight into the error of my previous ways. And more importantly, the overwhelming progress that can be made by simply adopting a Stoic attitude in my approach to day-to-day life. While I do not expect perfection of myself, I do believe that even the tiniest application of these concepts and philosophies will offer an enrichment of life for which I'm eternally grateful. And now that I have nothing more to say, I will take Marcus's suggestion and conclude this talk of what a good man should be and simply be one. And I think that's a neat way to the essay here. And with that, I'll hand it off. Ben, are you?
Yeah. Okay, so it's a real pleasure to be here today and to talk to you all today about philosophy in prison. And this is a subject that has pretty much taken over my life in the last 5 years. In that time, I've taught nearly 600 hours in prisons, 4 prisons across the UK. And I've personally witnessed the transformative power of studying philosophy firsthand. In this period, the outreach program I'm part of, which is the Crito project, we built up a vast repository of testimonies from our students and about what the process of doing philosophy in prison actually feels like. Rob, you've just spoken a great deal about your successes teaching Stoicism in prison with the Pathways from Prison initiative. And you know what? I too have seen Stoicism have the clearest and most lasting impact of any other modules I've delivered in those 5 years. So during my brief talk in a few slides, I'd like to pick out for you some of the voices of my students, specifically of Stoicism students, to help reinforce what Rob has just said, and to make clear the profound impact that studying philosophy has had upon so many students on my side of the Atlantic as well. So there's a myriad of ways we could talk about impact, right? I'd like to talk to you primarily about impact today. And it's a slippery concept, okay? So there are different themes to plot personal growth. For instance, on our analysis, we've shown that our students report a significant decrease in impulsivity, the formation of new pro-social tendencies, and an increase in self-control and reflection. And these are all praiseworthy achievements, right, in their own right. But underpinning them all for me is the aspiration to work on that part of you which holds ethical significance, to work on your character, to work on your mind. So I'll argue that philosophy stands out as an incredible toolkit with which to enable this kind of work. I'm going to put up some quotes from my students on page. I'm not going to read them out. You can read them if you want to. So I'm very interested in this idea of putting together all your methods, all your practice to form a new kind of identity and therefore a new way of acting. That's what I'm going to be talking about today. So in the following regard, I think you're all going to agree with me that we're all the same. We can all think back to a time when we were substantially different people. Value-wise, certainly, from where we are today. There was a time when we were not even aware of the existence of the voices, debates, and concepts that now figure so centrally in our world. We cared not at all for a person who now lights up our life. And we will stand and we will fight to protect an idea, a people, or a right that we may previously have just shrugged when you mentioned it to us, not even comprehended. More often than not, these seismic shifts were brought about by a new way of valuing something in our world. A new valuation is often the driver for adopting a new way of looking, a new set of skills, and a new way of organizing our life goals. I'll term this transvaluation. So a key question then becomes, how does transvaluation occur? Something happens in our lives to bring about a fundamental shift in how we attend to the world and our place in it. But it can't be accounted for solely in terms of wanting to change, right? Deciding to be different, that's not enough. They're both necessary, absolutely, but we often don't know how to change. We don't know which habits are needed. We might not exactly know what's out there in the world to care about in the first place. What's more, our attention is already occupied with what we already value as important. What we are currently valuing obscures what we might, if you will. So transvaluation becomes possible only when we get the chance to learn the world in a new way. Differences that were previously hidden now suddenly leap out at us, demanding that we make a decision as to how we stand in relation to them. Hitherto dull questions now burn brightly in our imaginations. And this new way of attending to the world often means our past, well, it makes a new kind of sense to us now. And sometimes that's not a particularly comfortable kind of sense that we have. Our new evaluations can render us in a new light to ourselves, and that can be quite painful. I think philosophy has that potential within it, to render yourself, your previous self, quite painful to your current self. It's interesting he speaks of bereavement. Because transvaluation becomes possible only when we get the chance to learn the world in a new way. Differences that were hidden now leap out at us, right? That's the point. So this new way of attending to the world often means our past is a weight upon us. But acquiring new values can change who we are at a basic level of identity. It's one of the things that changes you in a fundamental way, in a way that changing, for example, your brand of aftershave, your underpants, that doesn't change you fundamentally, right? changing your concept of what anger is, how it emerges in you, and what place it should have in your life, that's a fundamental change for you. That will have knock-on effects upon how you value things in the world. I think this possibility of deep transvaluation is one of the most rewarding things that philosophy can offer its students, within the prison or outside of the prison. So, these moments represent breaks in our understanding of ourselves, offering us the precious chance to begin again, to set off in a new direction according to new axioms. Personally, I teach about 6 modules in prison. And each of them asks the student tricky, deep questions. Okay? So, in class, you might ask the question, how do I go about living a good life? What the hell does that mean? And how do I do it? What's justice? And what would a just society look like? And do I live in a just society? Exactly how do I get to have knowledge of the world? How do I grasp facts and events and theories out of a rich field of phenomena which is presented to me? And what kind of thing is the mind that's doing all this grasping and speaking? The answers we can pose to any one of these events is the potential to unlock the world in new ways, ways that we could not have dreamt of before our studies began. It is through analysis, shared investigation, in particular by speaking in new ways in responding to these questions, that students learn to see through new frames, appreciate hidden beauty, and realize new potential. And in short, as students of philosophy, we grow. This work necessarily includes thinking, imagining, and reasoning in new ways. Often this process can be painful, as our incoherencies, biases, and assumptions become laid bare to us. But it also gives us a way to experiment, to act, to implement. We work. And let's be frank, we don't know if all this is going to pay off, right? The impersonation of someone we'd like to be. We meet face to face our self-doubts and our self-loathing, expressed unnervingly in our own voice. This process requires an inchoate leap into the dark, based on values we haven't fully formed yet. We must learn to believe in ourselves, despite ourselves. We gamble. So this discovery of new meaning and new evaluations in the world is also the means by which we self-author. As we learn to make fundamental shifts in how we weigh and judge, the world opens up to us and we take positions on its new facets. And those positions in turn make demands upon us. Simultaneously, previous demands and habits fade, and what was once demanding of all our attention can now be seen in a new light. In short, we can no longer carry on acting in the same way, given what we now know. Our old values are reduced, and with them, sometimes mercifully, the engine that drove our old behavior. So, by thinking about thinking and deploying different arguments in favor of contradictory positions, a philosophy student gets to feel what it's like to change their mind, to identify and evaluate in a different manner, to walk in another person's shoes. They get to road test new ethics and new heuristics and experience the benefits and problems that thereby arise. They are taught diagnostics in how to identify fallacious arguments, and then encouraged to turn that tool on their own habits of reasoning. They are given a new kind of freedom to think in new ways on their terms, sometimes for the first time in a long time. Now, prison is by definition a curtailing of your agency. But through philosophy, and in particular Stoicism, our students get to discover that the field with which they should be most concerned and from which they will gain the greatest benefit as reasoning agents is not close to them at all. Rather than being lost or forgotten, they are ideally placed to practice and establish a new identity, rooted in a new evaluation of themselves and their potential for academic excellence. So, to finish, I want to place this work in its wider context, right? And point out what all this means for the institutions involved. I hope it is self-evident how the impact of philosophy as outlined here can be of profound relevance to the institution, the prison. If we are truly interested in placing reform at the heart of our prisons, then philosophy and higher education in general, let's be real here, has a deciding role to play in such a re-evaluation. But it's my belief, and I suspect the belief of everyone here probably, that the university has just as much to gain in this relationship. The university that decides to enter prison understands itself in a new light. It is not just our students who are given an opportunity, a new opportunity for expression. A university's goals of equality and diversity can be richly realized when it connects with voices and perspectives that have previously been conspicuous by their excluded absence. Such a university gets to discover just who is in our prisons, what they're capable of, and if it plays its cards right, it can even have a say in who they decide to be when they walk out those gates. Thank you.
Misrepresent your slides by appearing with them, by speaking orthogonally to them. Really pleased to be here and especially on this panel to hear the very structured work in philosophy programming that Rob and Ben have done. Let me start by saying my work teaching in philosophy has been entirely more ad hoc than either of those endeavors. I'll subject you to a longer story of that this evening, so I'll keep my remarks here fairly brief and just give you a sense of an alternative kind of thing that philosophy in prison can be, separate from what I see as this very constructive instruction in Stoicism that we've just heard about. Something I have enjoyed teaching in prison is ethics. Now, this is something where if I tell somebody I teach in prison sometimes, they'll say, "Oh, do you teach ethics?" Because they, like they need some of it, the quantity, like ethics as a mass noun, like give them some. And that's not really what I teach, which can be in some ways as surprising to the students as to anybody else. My students inside, just like my students outside, whether they're undergraduates or if I'm teaching in an industry context, berating executives about something, tend to think of study in ethics as study that will tell you what to do, how to proceed, what the right thing is to do in a situation. And in fact, there are sub-disciplines under the broader heading of ethics which try to do exactly that. They try to give you some answers to thorny questions in medical ethics, say, or business ethics. That's not really my practice. I'm more interested in instruction in meta-ethics. That is to say, in ethical frameworks, in ethical systems. I'm interested in teaching about the nature of right and wrong, the nature of the good, rather than an answer in a particular setting. This can be very frustrating to somebody who feels like they need an answer in a setting. And while we've talked here a lot about continuities between teaching inside the prison and teaching outside, one discontinuity I've found is a heightened pressure to adopt a fixed view of right and wrong by some students in the prison. And I feel this arises because when in a context that is oppressive in the way that a prison can be, lacking freedom of movement and a lot of other freedoms, one is forced to try to make sense of how one got there and to create a narrative that explains that. And the narrative often takes the form of, I made a bad decision, or I did something wrong, or something was wrong that happened to me and I'm the victim. But a narrative has to be established and followed that has some parameters for kind of what the ethics were, so to speak, of the situation. So the first task, I think, in teaching ethics in prison is to release any strong grip that a student might have upon the definitive nature of what is right and wrong, in particular, in their own story, which doesn't mean that we're going to talk about each student's story. In fact, that's not something that a sort of encouraged confessional mode is not the sort of philosophy I like to practice. It does come up in class. Students will say, well, suppose there's a guy and he was in a car and he didn't know that the other guy had a gun, and it'll go on like this for a while. Suppose. The personal is always relevant, but the personal is not the point here. For me, the point is to destabilize the grip that any student has, whether inside or outside, on a particular moral judgment, and to reflect upon different frameworks. When I'm speaking of different moral frameworks, I mean things like this. I mean, for instance, a utilitarian framework, which tries to define what is right and wrong in terms of, say, the greatest happiness for the greatest number. This is something that's pretty common in our society today. It's the basis of a lot of economic theory, but we look at it in action and we try to figure out from the consequences of the action how much net, say, pleasure is created or net utility. That's one way of evaluating right and wrong. A totally different way of evaluating right and wrong is, say, what's sometimes called the deontological way, or a way that says, hey, there are maxims which tell you absolutely, perhaps on the basis of pure reason, what is right and wrong. There are maxims that say, well, you should absolutely do what your will should intend to do, regardless of consequences. So, for instance, you might say that lying is wrong. You might just think that it's intrinsically wrong, that it, in fact, would be incoherent to suggest otherwise. To suggest that you could speak falsely somehow undermines the very notion of speech. There's something analytically problematic there. So there are a lot of frameworks we can look at, but just to give you a sense of very different ways you could begin to approach the question of right and wrong. Those are two ways. I happen to be a particularist in my moral frameworks, and I like to interpret Aristotle as a particularist, as backing for my view, which, since I happen to mention it, is a view that says, actually, morality is not about principled action. We often think, do you follow principles? Are you a moral person? And particularism says that principles, if anything, are kind of a post hoc rationalization of action, or maybe rules of thumb or guidelines, heuristics to go by, but that real moral action is determined by your perception in a moment. Your perception developed by a certain type of character that's trained through education to discern in a particular context what is right or wrong. I like to present students with these different ways of thinking about ethics. What I'm trying to do in a prison classroom is to get the students to have a discussion with each other at this level, instead of at the level of what you did was wrong. I'm not so interested in that discourse. What's interesting to me is the way that the students can access another layer of contemplation, that they can think about the questions differently. For me, it's more of a destabilization of a certain type of sense, a certain sense of self that might have become too unhappily consolidated when they became incarcerated, which then in future stages would lead to something like this re-envisioning of self, the kind of work that Rob and Ben have spoken about. There are a lot of, just a few other comments I'll make about, in case anybody's about to go launch an ethics class in a prison, and say a few other things that have been handy to me in that context. One is using literature alongside philosophy to illustrate some of the themes that are being brought up. We talked about learning differences today, and it is certainly the case that some students respond more readily to concepts when presented in literature than when presented in an analytic text or in kind of that sort of discourse. You know, so if we'll take a concept, it was interesting, we were just talking about stoicism and control. So what comes to mind for me then is, well, what about moral luck? You know, so moral luck is an interesting problem in philosophy. You know, where our evaluation of somebody morally or of an act morally sometimes seems to turn upon factors that were not in their control. You can think of this maybe in a legal context more easily than a moral context. If somebody's drunk driving, it's one thing. If they're drunk driving and get in an accident or get caught, it suddenly seems like a different thing. But the difference between drunk driving and getting in an accident and drunk driving and not getting in an accident doesn't seem to be something about the ethical action of the individual. It seems to be good fortune or bad fortune. And yet somebody's treated differently by the law. There's a similar type of difference that happens in our moral evaluation of people. So if I'm teaching something like moral luck as a concept, maybe to trouble notions of Stoic virtue, if I were to do that, maybe I'd want to teach Antigone. So, you know, how is it the case? Antigone happens to be placed in a situation where, unfortunately, you know, she's caught in some difficult to manage tension of different demands. So let's say literature can be a useful tool in this project. One other thing I'll say, before then we get into maybe broader discussion, is that as much as I try not to have a discussion of ethics be about somebody's particular path into the prison, I do like to talk about other philosophers that have spent time in prison and other writers that have spent time in prison. This is evocative. You know, our favorite philosopher, I presume, is Socrates, who had a life sentence in prison, as it were. And to understand, for somebody in a prison class, to understand Socrates' stance when accused, how he defended himself, how he went along with the judgment against him, and in fact, how he accepted a death sentence, can be very evocative for them in again, releasing the grip that they have on a particular narrative about their own situation. I'll leave it there and we'll maybe have some discussion.
So that gives us about 1 hour to get a discussion going. 1 hour in philosophy means we have time for one question.
But I don't think my mic is on. Okay. Do you think there's something about it being philosophy, which almost everybody goes, what's philosophy with it? To take that, which most people don't know about, into the prison and show them that they can understand this esoteric, bizarre, elitist thing. Do you think there's something about it being philosophy with philosophy's reputation that actually helps the transformation that you talk about? Bob, go for it.
Oh, yes, ma'am. Yeah, I do. I mean, philosophy has two reputations, it seems to me, right? One is, as you described, this sort of elitist, egghead, ivory tower, technical sort of thing that nobody really understands what they're doing, right? They may as well be theoretical physicists or something like that. But on the other hand, there's the reputation of philosophy as what everybody does when they're stoned, right? Or what some guy with a French accent in the coffee shop is doing, right? So something like, right, so they think it's either a BS session or this other sort of thing, right? And I do think that they tend to come, students even at the university, right, not just in the prisons, tend to come with one or the other of those ideas. And what they usually find out is, in both cases, is that they're wrong, right? That's sort of destabilizing their conception of philosophy, right? And in a very practical way, what I try to do, and I was talking to Damon about this earlier, is we'll sit down and read these texts that are supposed to be super hard and difficult and all that. We read them together out loud, right? And so I was kind of modeling it a little bit when I was presenting, right? We'll read this stuff out loud and just talk about it, right? Not as though there's some sort of magic key we have to use to unlock it, but we talk about it together, and then it sort of demystifies it both, I think, from both directions, in that it makes it less inaccessible, but also not merely BS, right? So I think that lends, the preconceptions and the actuality, I think, do lend themselves to transformation in some ways. I imagine you guys have something to say.
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I think it acts as a guard, really. It stops people from coming into my class quite often. I have to work quite hard to explain what the hell philosophy is. I use a lot of quotes around the prison. I put up posters. I try and kind of make it approachable because it does have this quite off-putting appearance. But I think what sells it to my students is, compare it to psychology. Okay, so psychology is embedded within the parole system. Psychology is embedded within the system of discipline and order and maintenance of the life of a person in prison. And so naturally, it's seen in quite a combative and negative way sometimes. But the role of a therapist is very different from the role of a philosophy tutor, because a philosophy tutor is just giving you tools. Right? You're given a set of tools, and you develop them together, and you go and do what you want with them. And you come to your own positions, and then you feed those back, and you get the second order level of discussion going on. That's a really beautiful thing about philosophy. And I'm not saying psychology isn't capable of that. This is not a dig against psychology in any way, but just from the point of view of the prisoner, it can give them that space, which might be foreclosed by their relationship with parole, for example.
I agree with all that. The only thing I might add as a selling point, a further selling point, as it were, of philosophy, is the idea that when you do philosophy, you're testing your own foundations. And nobody wants to be on unsure foundations. Nobody wants to be walking around with an idea that somebody else could undermine if they just tipped it a little bit to the side. So there's something about the integrity of your thinking, you know, classically the integrity of an examined life, which I think is a form of strength, a good kind of strength, not, you know, just the macho show of strength, but it's a sense of resilience and robustness, which still isn't about having the right answer. It's about having explored the landscape, to know the things that the environments, you know, the environments like the other, that could come at you in different ways, to know the landscape of how you might maneuver and your own stance within it. I think that's a, rather than being scary, I think that's a strengthening proposition.
Sure. Not speaking from a prison perspective, but in the introduction to philosophy classes that I've taught before, we spend a substantial amount of time trying to unpack what philosophy is before we even do much of it. And I get two types of students who come in usually, and it's those who signed up for it having no idea what it is, or those who are completely wrong about it. And it makes for an interesting start because we have to orient ourselves. And I think it's no different in the prison system. Same students with misconceptions or having no idea. We've had students in the Stoicism class who signed up for it. They had no idea. They just knew they got to go to a class from the University of Wyoming. And by the end, it was life-changing.
Hi, I'm just wondering a little bit about, I think, Damon, you spoke a little bit about it, like the sharing of narratives or stories and how that can be maybe not the intention of the curriculum, but an inevitable sort of part. And I'm curious too if any of you have taught the same courses in both men's and women's facilities and seen a difference in terms of the sharing or the classroom dynamics that arise around some of the content.
Yeah, I've taught this Stoicism course in both in men's and women's facilities here in Wyoming. And the women are typically more forthcoming about their story. And I'm sure there's lots of hypotheses as why that is. The men tend to be much more closed off. We have to, the men are also harder to challenge about these preconceptions like that Damon was talking about, that they think are so fixed about who I am and what I'm supposed to be. They tend to be a bit more rigid about that and take a little more sort of intellectual shaking. Is that the sort of thing?
Yeah, well, I just am wondering too, like what then, I mean, maybe it's different, maybe it's not. What can you as the instructor do to create that safe space or safeguard students in also sharing their stories and narratives, and how do you kind of keep it focused on the content? And then also I'm especially interested in, since you shared that the women were more forthcoming, how your role as a man in the classroom, how that played into the dynamic, and if you can talk a little bit about that.
I'll start. I'm sure you guys have stuff to say about that. But so when I've gone in, I go in a small group, right? So it had been multiple cases, been Alec and I and a couple of students or former students. I see a couple. Cody here and Riley back there have done it. I haven't noticed too much of an issue personally with any sort of weird tension with me being a man in the women's prison. In fact, our group there was all men. But I guess I'm sort of building off a bit of what Damon said, as I try to just emphasize, like, I'm interested in the more meta question, right? I don't here want to get into, what was the term somebody used earlier, trauma porn, right? I don't want to be voyeuristic about your story, right? And sometimes, occasionally there will be an inmate who maybe starts oversharing a little bit. I always try to step back a little bit and say, and ask specific questions. It's very sort of context dependent. Like, so, but what is that, how do we couch that point in the concepts we're dealing with here? And I try to keep it at that level, right? But it's a constant sort of interplay, and you have to really be paying attention to how that dialogue goes. Did you guys want to add?
Something briefly. I'll say something briefly about using kind of introductory heuristics in the beginning of a class to set some groundworks. I find that to be really useful, especially when you're doing Stoicism. Stoicism, you're talking about this kind of transvaluation of your understanding of the world, a reformulation of your own emotions. Incredibly challenging stuff. You can draw up all kinds of stuff. It's happened to me in a class, right? For my own self, you know. So yes, safe space is really important, and most important of all, making sure that everyone gives every other student in the class the right kind of charity. And by charity principle, I mean, when you read a text, you always try and look for the best possible argument in that text, for example. You don't just slough it off, oh, well, he's used this particular term and it's so gaucher, you know. You don't do that. You look for the best and you deal with the best, just the same with people in the classes. So that's helped a lot. The one time a class has come close to violence in my 5 years was on the concept of God. Thank goodness that we talked about the charity principle at the beginning of that class, because it allowed me to go back to the fundamentals and say, come on, you can't seriously be talking about hating this guy. So, yeah.
I mean, sorry, just because, I mean, we do have time for discussion, right? I just want to say that I think that one of the things I've noticed, and I've worked in both men's and women's facilities, and I too feel that our women students are often more readily forthcoming with their stories and narratives, and also how, I mean, for some of our students, it's the first opportunity they've also had to comfortably share a story. And I think it makes me nervous too, right? Because there's not a lot of parameters, and curriculum that evokes this type of self-reflection is so important. And then also how it plays out in the classroom, and when people are sharing, and the idea of feeling forced to compel, or wanting to, compelled to tell your story, or that you should tell your story, or being re-traumatized by the telling of someone else's story, I think is just a tricky thing. And as educators going into the prison classroom, something we have to continue to be self-reflexive about. And just to share a story too, this is a little bit my soapbox right now, but I was working, there were some colleagues of ours who were presenting at a conference about trauma-informed pedagogy in a women's facility, and they were both men. And before the presentation, I just said I would really love to hear, I'm excited to hear how you guys feel as your role as male educators going into a women's prison classroom has an effect on what happens in the classroom. And they were sort of like, what do you mean? And what I find sometimes is that our women students, and this might be true too of the men, but our women students, the first positive interaction with a man that wasn't around sex or violence can be a male professor. And there's an added sort of responsibility or I don't even know what it is, of that male educator, I feel like, in that context, to really uphold certain boundaries and be aware. I mean, this is my soapbox, and I'm sharing this because there's also time to have this conversation, but as a woman entering men's facilities, it's something I'm constantly counseled about. And when we were talking about outfit choice, and I'm a young woman going into facilities, and I've been spoken to both with my organization and the prison administration about being aware of where I stand and how I speak and what it means. And I personally feel that the same scrutiny isn't given to men going into women's facilities. And it's something that I've really tried hard to train my male faculty going into women's facilities about. Just the very presence of a man in a women's facility can be triggering or traumatizing to a student. The tone of your voice, where you're standing in the room, and things like that, and just how those dynamics play out in these really sensitive conversations where we're asking students to reflect about who they are and what they want and who they want to be. I mean, it's so intense, and I just am in general curious and about how we can think about this on a deeper level and talk to each other about it as practitioners.
I mean, I would say that my own experience, and I've done the women's facility once, right? And the cohort of students I brought with me were also all men. I think I was, and I encourage them to be, very self-aware of boundaries, about power relations, right? Because there is sort of an intellectual intimacy that you don't want to slide into anything else, right? In those situations. And it's similar, I mean, it's not totally foreign to a university context, right? If I'm in office hours and a young female student is coming to talk to me in office hours, she's going to sit on the other side of the desk from me, and the door's going to be open, things like that, right? So now you don't get that exact same sort of thing in the prison context, because we're usually stuck into a room that's a little too small, and there's not enough room for everybody to spread out comfortably and so on. But I guess I don't have anything a whole lot deeper to say about my experience than that high level of self-awareness and self-reflectiveness on that. And I think that's really important in both men's and women's prison contexts, right? I mean, it's,
Can I just make an observation
Yeah.
about that dynamic? I think that's going to vary from state to state, honestly. I've been in the women's facility here, and the personnel were mainly men. So the women are used to their daily lives interacting with men. If they're having issues, they're counseling, they're going to men mostly. And so, yes, certainly the practitioners who come in, the educational people who come in have to be aware of that. But I think that dynamic may be different from state to state, depending on the personnel. But I would just say
that, I mean, yes, sure, and that, you know, male corrections officers or male prison administrators, but the intimacy of a man asking you to look at who you are and what you believe and you know, in the context of even a class. I mean, not intentionally, that I'm not saying that the philosophy inherently is somehow exploitive of students at all, but just, I think that there is a dynamic of that type of emotional or intellectual intimacy that's being created from a man in an authority position as a professor, invoking this type of thought that can be extremely productive and wonderful and also really intense and painful. And just that there's no, and at least in New York State, there's not a lot of recourse in terms of counseling or therapy or mental health for our students when we leave the facility, that to go in and to start that process, you know, and again, it's incredibly healing for our students too. It's the first opportunity some of our students have had to really wrestle with this stuff in their head and in their hearts and really start piecing things together in their stories. And it's so valuable. I just wonder, again, what is that awareness that we go in with? How can we foster a productive learning opportunity that is safe? Because yeah, they are used to men, but maybe not men you know, starting these types of conversations that are going to, you know, bring up these certain feelings.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'd like to get back to, Rachel, your kind of initial opening remark about whether or not people are sharing and what that means. So what I've found from all of your perspectives and your experiences that you've been talking about, that there's a lot in there that we now find in prison research or in research on I don't know, stopping offending behavior in yourself as very valuable. The idea that you, Ben and I have been talking about this idea of desistance, that you well, you can't change your past, but you can actually act differently in the future, and that you have to find it in yourself to do that, to find the agency to do that. And I have the impression that for a lot of people, or for some people in prison, philosophy can be like an opportunity to find this agency. And what seems especially striking to me is that you talk about a lot of the things that people are talking about in the predominant psychological programming that we see in prisons at the moment, which is cognitive behavioral therapy that is based on the risk, need, responsivity principles developed by Don Andrews and others from the Canadian Correctional Service, the Correctional Service Canada. But the problem there is that you are forced to again confess in these sessions. Usually you're forced to talk about your crime, how you went there, and then it's talked and talked and talked over and over again to avoid in the future to do that again. And that is very difficult for a lot of people in prison because it actually goes at the essence of themselves. You have to talk about why you thought about things the way you thought about things, and then change that. And that is something nobody really wants to do. But for me, the philosophy in prison seems to be some sort of a low threshold opportunity to engage in that. And if you don't want to do that, then okay, it's just something you learn, something, information about something. But if you really want to do and take that as a stepping stone, you can actually get something out of that for yourself without having to confess again and again and again and again. So yeah, well done. Thank you for this good idea.
Yeah, I wouldn't mind saying something. I mean, firstly, thank you so much. Yeah, that's a really good set of points there. CBT is related to Stoicism quite closely, and its kind of initial theoretical kind of appearance is quite tied to and influenced by thinkers such as Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus. So yeah, that's a very nice mapping and kind of similarity there. But specifically responding to the idea of confession, yeah, that has no place. That has no place in the philosophy class. What kind of role would I take in that position? I don't feel comfortable in any way in that sense. However, I do feel comfortable inculcating or helping a student to develop an appetite for self-investigation, to develop a set of tools for rational critique, and to provide them with a set of kind of methods by which to re-understand and re-evaluate things like emotion, things like agency in the world, things like moral luck. It's a really important point. So I think philosophy can walk a cunning and thin line between kind of staid and cold declaration and over-the-top confession, forced confession. So yeah.
Just as a quick afterthought, I mean, even for those people in your classes who are not fully into it during the class or directly after that, that is probably still a seed for potential change in the future. We've seen in research on desistance that it takes years and years for some people to actually get their head around it, and then still they think about things that they've heard years before from their probation officer, and at some point in their life it makes sense. So even if people are not totally into it at the moment, it may be a valuable thing in the future.
I'd just like to add one little bit from my experience with Stoicism in particular. I mean, like Ben said, Stoic philosophy really is sort of the conceptual root from which CBT, we know from the guys who originated CBT that they were thinking about Epictetus and Marcus, which is really neat. But there's a lot of programming that's based on CBT and other varieties in the psychosocial side, for sure. What I've heard from numerous students over and over again is, there's like a theoretical framework behind what we do in anger management class, right? And a lot of them have found that that's really sort of made them rethink a little bit the ideas they get, the CBT sort of based ideas they get in some of their psychosocial programming, and seeing that there's more systematicity to it than they've gotten out of having to come in and confess, right? That I think a lot of them have found really valuable.
If I could add one thing to that, I appreciate this more nuanced discussion than I usually give of this topic, so I'm pleased for the question and the responses. I would also like to remind us, however, in addition, that there are different lenses to look at philosophy and prison through. And it's not, the only valid lens is not necessarily how does this class factor into the student's psychological development. There are other things that you can be doing in teaching a class, especially to the extent that we're saying we're giving an education that's similar to the education we give on the outside, in which case usually we're not explicitly concerned with where each student is in terms of their psychological development, but their challenges and their opportunities, and moving that along as though the base layer of activity is one of therapy. But we're interested in introducing them to a world of intellectual ideas, moving through that landscape. So there are different places on the spectrum where we can kind of place our emphasis, depending upon our priorities.
Let's quickly say something in response to that. What you were saying earlier on, really is very pertinent to philosophical education for that reason, because you want your student to have this kind of remarkable bolt face by exposure to your favorite philosopher. So you have to be really careful. And so, yeah, just want to thank you again for that. I'm going to be chewing on that for the next couple of weeks.
Hi. My understanding of how we look at the incarcerated population is that we predominantly see them as being antisocial, right? That's something we accuse them of, as being antisocial. My organization is based in the philosophy of Ubuntu. I exist because I've learned from others, right? And we exist together and we balance each other. So I have a couple of ideas here that I just kind of want to throw out to you. I was going to say they're unrelated, but I think when we're talking about philosophy, pretty much everything is related, right? So I want to ask you about, like, how do you talk about the social fabric or civic society? So one of my concerns is, what are we doing about pro-social, right? A lot of what I hear is mostly about the individual and not how they are in society. The other question is, you had talked about the only fight was about God. Yeah. I really want to talk about belief, right? And faith, right? Faith in ourselves working together even. So how do we do that and kind of dance within and around the topic of God? There's the hour, right? There's our
well, sounds easy. So I'll start.
Well, I'm glad. Yeah, the concept of reimagining notions of the self to include others. That's absolutely fundamental. And you're probably getting a bit bored of hearing the word already. But Stoicism is absolutely rooted in the concept of cosmopolitanism, which is to say, yes, we're self-interested, but we do a grave disservice to ourselves and to everyone around us if we consider ourselves to be limited to the individual. The self is grown and only makes sense in the presence of others. So one of the really nice things about Stoic practice is, as compared to other forms of kind of reflective or wisdom traditions, nearly all Stoic practice is either done in the presence of other people or done thinking about what's going to happen when you're in the presence of other people. And the concept of justice in Stoicism is not some dry and staid kind of calculus. Justice is concerned with the fundamental social nature of self, what it means to be a linguistic creature which cannot find sense or purpose without others. What it means for me to be flapping bits of wet meat together right now, bouncing sound around the room, and it's landing in your head, and voila, we've got some kind of meaning transmission going on here. That makes ants look like loners. Right? So we have to acknowledge our fundamental social nature before we can get close to the good life, before we can get close to being what a rational creature is. Sure, so you've got a philosophy of sharks, that's going to look very different to a philosophy of humans. So Stoicism starts from an account of what we are. So yeah, it's front and center for me. It's probably the most important concept in Stoicism for me, is that cosmopolitanism. So I'm going to just bleep right over God.
Thank you.
Another thing, just to pound the heck out of Stoicism some more. Another thing that Stoicism talks about is our relationship to one another through roles that we have. Right? Because I'm, say, a father, I have certain sort of connections that I wouldn't have if I weren't. Because I'm a son, I have certain connections that otherwise I wouldn't, and that dictates something about how I interact with the world. And, some of those roles are questions of moral luck, right? And some we get to sort of pick and choose, right? Because I am a teacher, right? I have certain sort of things that I'm then obligated to and entitled to, right? And I can do that well or badly, right? In all of those cases. So that's another way in which our social connections are really fundamental to Stoic thought. Yeah.
And I think that a substantial amount of philosophical inquiry does start with self-reflection, self-analysis, gaining control of your thought process, but it doesn't stay there necessarily. It usually leads to this concept of expanding circles of moral and civic responsibility. And I won't go into the specifics of all the different philosophies, but it's fairly common through a number of schools.
Philosophy is not about answers. But I would like to say about the social question, wholly apart from different philosophies in the way they characterize the human being as a social animal, there's the mere fact of our learning environment. And a lot of what's happening is introducing people into a certain kind of discourse community. Prior to the content of philosophy and separate from the psychology of the participants is the fact of the behavior, how we conduct ourselves as philosophers with each other. And that has a lot to do with some of the things that were mentioned earlier, like about charitable interpretation of others, what we are listening for when somebody else is speaking. So that whole set of social practices, I find, cuts across philosophies and is probably as important as the philosophies themselves.
Well, I'd like to follow up on that notion. I guess being a philosopher, I have to be a skeptic about Stoicism. I guess my question is, how important is Stoicism per se, and how important is it that you've created this discourse community? So let's take it to the next meta level. Right? Is it really about Stoicism, or could this be done with pragmatism? Could this be done with existentialism? If not ethics, could this be done with aesthetics? Could it be done with epistemology? Is it about getting people into a certain kind of attitude and disposition, interaction, respectful discourse? In that, whether it's Stoicism, maybe that's a good, maybe that's good content, but I wonder if the virtues and the benefits of this have a whole hell of a lot to do with that, or if you worked this hard and intensively and respectfully and did it with existentialism and aesthetics, you would get very similar outcomes. So let's take it to the next meta level. Is that what it's about?
So I want to say yes and no, right? Typical philosopher's answer, right? So the way I think about it in this context is what I really want them to do is to think about how they think of themselves in relation to the rest of the world. It involves conceptions about what the rest of the universe is like, conceptions about what a self is like, what a human being is, and all of that. I use Stoicism for a number of reasons, but Stoicism is just one way of doing that on offer, right? So could we do it? I mean, I think there could be value, there is value just in the doing of any sort of difficult intellectual work together, I think without a doubt. But if I want to get them thinking about self and other, self and universe, self, right? And then Stoicism is a particularly useful way of doing that, but I don't think by any means it's the only way to do that. And a lot of the students, in my experience, come in with a whole lot of ideas about what that is, about themselves, and just the ones who are sort of most sort of rigid about it tend to be pretty devout Christians or something like that, and we want to sort of destabilize that a little bit. But in the end, I tell them, I don't really care whether you become a Stoic, right? But what I do care is that we can think about these questions that Stoicism brings to the forefront.
I think the meta question is a good question, and it's an important one, and I think we can go further. Since we're going meta, let's go all the way, right? Let's do literature and history. The humanities as a vast field of reconceiving of the world and our place in it. Yes, 1,000 times yes. I think this project could be done looking at the Russian Revolution, absolutely. I think you could do it in terms of pragmatism, American pragmatism, 100%, absolutely. However, the field of inquiry in Stoicism, rightly or wrongly, if the model is flawed, great. That's always exciting to discover in a class. I don't think it's the perfect package by any means. But the subject of Stoicism, which is re-evaluating what a reasoning mind is, what the motions that occur as a consequence of those thoughts are, discovering principles for the dignity of your own self-organized kind of thought. Those are a really powerful set of kind of inquiries, and they can be done. That's not really specific to Stoicism, I suppose. I think an Aristotelian approach is just as powerful. But I will say, in Stoicism's defense, it gives a set of ready-to-hand heuristics, which are incredibly powerful in the deranged levels of stress that our students find themselves in. They want something that works, and boy, does it work.
On this topic of Stoicism, how do you reconcile the idea of like dichotomy of control with the reality that in this country, most incarcerated people are impoverished people of color who may not have access to the same range of choice and opportunity? And to put it differently, in the face of such obvious systemic power imbalances, why promote an ideology of individual responsibility? Thank you.
I'm going. Okay. Okay. So when we talk about what's in our control, I think it's a really problematic term, and I think another way of putting it is what's ultimately up to us. But when you talk about these aspects of moral luck and the structural conditions and asymmetric power relationships which people find themselves within, none of that really argues against Stoicism. Stoicism is just going to say, yeah, absolutely. But being someone within that system is not going to determine what kind of person that is. You're going to find someone in that system, in that situation, in that context, which is that person is loathsome to you, vile. And you find someone else who you just fall in love with and idealize and want to be. And they're like a person who sits on your shoulder and they advise you. So there's something about that person which is has moral value to you and worth to you as a guide or as a warning, which is independent of their conditions in which they find themselves. That's really the Stoic message. So we shouldn't think of it, it's certainly not the case that Stoicism is saying that you're responsible and it's all about you, and if you're a bad person, you're a bad person, and it's disgusting how you got into the situation. It's more to do with building a set of tools by which you can kind of slough off these considerations and make a new kind of self that you want to be. And what's the best method of that? Well, I think reason does have an important part to play in that. So no, I don't think we have to throw away systemic accounts of injustice or asymmetric roles within our society. In fact, I think we need them. If we're going to talk about justice, which is the primary concern of Stoicism, how to be a good agent in a social situation, that's it, really. That's what Stoicism is trying to prod you into doing. What we can't do without structural analyses. It's not possible, in my opinion. So, yes, I am very alive to that concern. We have to be careful. And you do see Stoicism radically misused in our society, and it's really worrying. And, we were talking about this earlier on. I mean, I'll hand over to you if you want to talk about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think Stoicism, so I mentioned that Marcus Aurelius, the most powerful man in the world, is this great advocate for Stoicism, and that's something all can look to. Epictetus, who I also quoted from, was in fact born into slavery, right? So as a matter of sort of historical perspective, it's supposed to be a philosophy applicable to living a good life, whether one's a slave or an emperor, right? It's how does one live well regardless of those circumstances, while still recognizing that what it doesn't want to say, I think, which maybe from your question
it might seem to say, is that you are responsible for the situation you're born into, or, right? And Stoicism, in fact, denies that, right? So you aren't morally responsible for being poor or being oppressed in some other way, right? But you are morally responsible for the choices you make from that position, not the consequences or outcomes of those choices, but for the choices themselves, right? And we can do that well or badly in any situation, right? Is the idea. Whether it can fully pull that off or not is a much longer discussion, I think, right? But that's the hope anyway.
One thing I want to add, if I'm teaching philosophy anywhere, inside or outside, something I would hope to avoid would be the acceptance of one dominant framework for how to look at the world. A particularly likely such framework, especially working in a prison system, is to look at the world through the lens of power relations. That's why a lot of people will get involved, because they'll say something's clearly unjust about how this came to be. But to reduce everything that takes place to that system of power relations, I think, is unphilosophical in a certain sense. What one wants to do is say, here's how the world looks if you look at it through power relations, but here if you look at it in terms of the march of reason, or here's how it looks in terms of the development of goodwill. That much being said, I think there's some very interesting questions about the status of choice in our society. And so I would agree with you that kind of, if there were an uncritical endorsement of choice as the fundamental principle, that we were going to say, this is what your fate turns on, or your moral worth, there are a lot of ways that we can trouble that suggestion as philosophers. We can say, well, how is it that one makes choices? From what character does one come to be making a choice? And what shaped that character? So I think there's a clue that something's amiss if we only say the choice is what matters, but neither do I think we should say only power relations matter.
I also want to make the comment, I really appreciate your comment a lot, and this is something I've struggled with a lot in the context of any discussion about agency in the prison setting. And I think, but very often, what we respond to, I think appropriately, very allergically, is the implication, which is so common in the kind of correctional ideology at times, or sort of vocabulary or framework, which implies this kind of level moral playing field, right? And well, like the kind of asinine, well, people make choices, you know, like as if someone had offered me $100 to deliver a bag of Coke when I was 12, and I did it, or decided not, I just said no because, you know, I just went without groceries and diapers for my younger siblings, right? Like, happened to me never. So, you know, I mean, so I'm really sensitive to the implication that somehow, oh, we're all just making choices and we're being moral or not moral. But I really also appreciate the point that absolutely, given that huge, you know, caveat that the ground is in no way level, there is agency everywhere. There are decisions, there is morality. These questions are relevant, and I've found it personally really humbling and exciting to encounter the resistance of people inside to my assumption that they had no power and no agency. So, I think that we also, and speaking for myself, I feel like I've had to really pay attention to that, to my assumption that people who are incarcerated are simply passive victims. Because I think for them that is not just sort of degrading or demoralizing, but it is a distortion of their reality. So anyway, but I appreciate the whole conversation very much.
So I was just curious, in Stoicism, I was curious if why Stoicism works is a result of what it says you have control over, because with other systems you have, like Aristotle's view of eudaimonia, there are certain physical conditions that if you don't have them, you can't be, you know, happy or flourishing, or however you want to translate that. And I was curious if that matter of control and focusing on, if we should from a practical standpoint, focus on systems that allow happiness or something roughly equivalent to it to be under our control, and if we should limit the education to things that are like that, or if we should open it up to all of these different possibilities, even if some of them are the kind that say, oh, well, happiness isn't available to you because you don't have this set of material conditions, right? And so I was just curious about that.
Do you mind if I answer? Yeah, so I don't think you can teach Stoicism without teaching the Socratic tradition more generally, and certainly Aristotle. And I also think Epicureanism. I think you get the whole kit and caboodle, quite frankly. If you go in for one, you've got to go in for the others. And I also don't think Aristotelianism has to be limited by this classic problem of it, that if you're a woman, if you're from the wrong family, sorry, no good luck for you. Well, I think we're at a position where we can update Aristotle's kind of position a little bit ourselves. So I think the nature of the good and what we take to be the good, the moral good, whether that lies outside of our control or inside of our control, that's fundamental to what kind of philosophy you end up with. So I always get an Aristotelian in my class, always, always get an, and it's almost necessary. I'm upset if everyone's singing from the Stoicism sheet, quite frankly, because what have I done in that situation? I've been brainwashing or hitting people over the head with this stuff. That's a failure as a teacher to end up with 100% Stoics. You want a snide Epicurean at the back. So that's my opinion on the subject. I don't think we should be hard and fast Stoics in that way. I don't think we should certainly teach in that way. I think that's a kind of form of poverty, which is what you were speaking about. That's
Other questions? Yes.
I study psychology, and I come from a position where I see valuing reason and rationality over the expression of emotion as tools that have been historically used to pathologize and institutionalize women, and especially women of color. And I'm also thinking a little bit about how beyond that, philosophy tends to be a pretty masculine field with a pretty masculine history. I'm just curious if those are values that you see play out, or something that you've considered, or kind of how you reconcile that when you teach Stoicism.
Can I please answer that one?
Go for it.
I'm a woman philosopher, and every advance that women and minorities have had has come from rational argumentation combined with social activism. To characterize rationality, logical thought, as masculine is the greatest disservice humanity has done to humanity, which was far too strong. We've done far worse things. But the characterization that there's something masculine about rationality, when you look at the history of Western civilization, I don't know enough to say about Eastern, when you look at the history and you see that there has been advances that stayed with us, you can go back and find John Stuart Mill arguing why, Harriet Taylor Mill arguing why. And there's a wonderful article that I will be happy to give you by a current woman philosopher, Margaret Atherton, who shows that social progress occurs because of rational argumentation.
You want to? I mean, if you could, I'd like to briefly. You've presented this concept of reason and emotion standing in some kind of antagonistic relationship. That's certainly not the case in the Stoic tradition. That's a Platonic model of reason and emotion. That you've got these one horse pulling you up, one winged horse pulling you up, one pulling you down. Stoicism seems to reconcile the two and say that emotion is always a cognitive event. You always have to have a belief about the world in order to develop an emotional response to it. You have to have an evaluation of the world. So I think it helps to collapse that binary distinction. And I think of people like Barrett today. I really like her work on emotion. So I think modern emotional theory, I also think of people like Ledoux and his work on the amygdala, and how he comes to this, pretty much the same position as the Stoic, which is to say, you can't say that the amygdala gives fear, because fear is a cognitive evaluation. It may provide the kind of the pre-passion or the pre-emotional kind of constituents, which gets interpreted and leads to either elation or fear. But you're making a mistake if you say that it's a different kind of quality. Lived reason, embodied reason is emotional. And so it's really important to bear that in mind. The Stoics, they had a lot of things wrong, but they were really interesting in terms of emotions. I think Plato had it completely wrong, and I think the Stoics were right about this. So, but you may not agree.
Yeah, me again. I just wanted to make a quick remark. We should not think that because we are talking about philosophy in prison now, this is like the key to like the only thing that is happening there. Yeah. And that might answer also your or be a remark to your remark, because even if we see philosophical education in prison as some sort of a tool set for prisoners to find agency in themselves, agency is necessary but not sufficient to actually make it outside. You need other people, your family, you need employment office, welfare authorities. You need a society that actually thinks that at some point it's enough with the punishment. And that, for example, maybe that's my German take on it, your criminal record is not open to everyone. That would be an idea for something like reintegration, but I know that's different in the US. So, or other things. I mean, you need the society to be receptive, and you cannot do that on your own. And philosophy lessons in prison cannot do that, but other things can do that. And if you want to become engaged in that, you can also do something about that, but maybe not by teaching prisoners, but by teaching other people.
Yeah.
Okay.
I would add, we also have to be ready for when those systems fail us. When we re-engage with society and it chronically fails us, well, we're back to square one in that sense. How do we deal with that situation? So that's back to agency again.
Yeah, you have to decide to do that, actually. Yeah, that's your choice.
Well then, thank you, panel, very much.
Thank you.